The most obvious group, institutionally, that faces a conflict simply as part of the job consists of people who put their lives on the line, their safety on the line, their health on the line. So here I'm thinking of police officers, firefighters, military personnel, medical personnel who are constantly coming into contact with the injured and the sick, psychologists who are dealing with people who are sometimes potentially dangerous. All of those people are putting their own safety on the line when they do their jobs. And so the professional responsibility of a firefighter quite frequently comes into conflict with their interest in their own personal safety. The same thing is true with police officers, with prison guards, with a variety of people in professions like that, where they are placing themselves in physical danger. We admire those people. We think what they're doing is heroic, and society depends on that. But it also creates a danger here. How do we keep people from policing, from conducting medicine, from firefighting in ways that maximize their own safety as opposed to actually promoting the public good and serving the people they're trying to serve? Now, luckily, most of the people in those fields are involved in those fields because they really are dedicated to helping others. So it tends to be a less severe problem here than you might think, given the immediacy of the danger and the salience of the personal interest that's at stake, its directness. But there can be such issues, and sometimes they become very acute. What do you do in a situation where, for example, you're in a neighborhood, you're policing a neighborhood where there's a great deal of hostility toward the police? How do you advise the police to behave? What should they do? They're placing themselves in great danger simply by being there. And the same thing can be true of firefighters. There are certain kinds of situations that are far more dangerous than others for firefighters. Similarly with medical personnel. The average doctor or nurse or orderly or aide and so on is probably not placing themselves in that great a risk on an average day in the hospital. But at a time of pandemic, at a time of, let's say, widespread rioting in the city, where there's been a great deal of violence and so on, they may be in much greater physical danger than at other times. And so what do we do about that? There are complicated questions here. We can't avoid conflicts of interest, but we do want to protect our personnel at the same time we want them to be successful in protecting the public. And that's a difficult trade-off, a difficult balance to achieve. Professions that self-regulate, certified public accountants, for example, or attorneys, or college professors, or many, many others, adopt certain rules and certain principles for admission to the profession and for conduct within the profession. These professional groups have dueling obligations. They have, on the one hand, an obligation to serve the public interest, and so to actually get excellent attorneys, excellent doctors, excellent dentists, nurses, college professors, and so on, to do their jobs then effectively and well within the profession. But of course, their interests are also served by limiting access to that profession. Lawyers don't want just anybody to be practicing law. Doctors don't want just anyone to practice medicine. Professors don't want just anyone to be able to teach courses. And so there are various barriers to entry. Now, to some extent, those barriers of entry are legitimate. We really do want somebody to have medical training or legal training or training in whatever field they're teaching if they're a professor. And so that's an important thing. But on the other hand, those licensing requirements and the professional obligations that go with them, the degrees required, the professional certifications required, and so on, may or may not have to do with actually performing that job well. For example, it's a relatively recent phenomenon that to become an attorney, you actually have to have a law degree, go to law school. It used to be that you simply apprenticed under another attorney, you studied the law, you had to pass an exam, but you didn't actually have to go to a law school to do that. People typically learned on the job as an apprentice to someone else, and a lot of professions still operate in that way. The same thing used to be true of all sorts of other professions. In fact, being a professor now basically requires a PhD. There are a few exceptions for some superstars who get hired when they don't have a PhD and in some cases only have a BA, but that used to be much more common. And so that's the situation where we say, well, now you have to have a PhD. But of course, you didn't used to have a PhD. Does it matter? Is that something that's really necessary to be able to be an effective teacher of a certain subject at a college or university? So those professional barriers, you might say, have tended to rise. Some of that is related to demanding excellence and or at least competence in a certain profession. But there's a tendency to overinflate those to keep competition out and keep salaries and benefits higher. There are other kinds of things, because once you're admitted to the guild, once you're part of the club, then there's an incentive to actually not police the ranks very carefully. Professions have an incentive internally to inflate what's required for entry into the profession, but then to actually have too low a level of what's required to remain a member in good standing of that profession. And so there is a kind of dual conflict of interest going on there. We want to make it hard to enter our profession, but then easy to stay there. And all of these self-policing professions are like that. Another institutional conflict of interest, people who are paid by the hour. Attorneys tend to be paid by billable hours. They bill a certain number of hours to working on that legal problem. The same thing is often true of certified public accountants. It's, for that matter, true of many blue-collar professions. The plumber, the auto mechanic, bill you for the number of hours it took, for the labor charge that's involved. Something analogous to that happens often in construction, where jobs are contracted on a cost-plus basis. It's, well, whatever it costs us to do this, labor plus materials, plus some profit margin. And of course, that gives everybody an incentive to increase the number of hours, to say, partly it can be an incentive to falsify records, to claim more billable hours than really went into the job, but it can also be, even apart from that, an incentive to accept jobs that are going to be more complex, that are going to rack up more billable hours. And so to neglect the easy stuff and the stuff on which I happen to know the most and am the most competent in favor of the things that are large and complex and where I'm actually the least competent. And I'm going to have to spend hours making myself more confident, in effect training myself and billing the training to you. So that kind of thing can be part of all of these professions. It's very dangerous to agree to a cost-plus contract, and yet that's what almost everybody who engages the services of an attorney or a certified public accountant, or for that matter, an electrician or plumber or auto mechanic is doing. And so there is a kind of conflict of interest built into that institutional structure, into that contractual relationship. The last example of this kind of institutional conflict I want to mention is one we've already discussed before. It concerns the principal-agent problem. Any agent faces a conflict of interest. They have a personal interest in promoting their own interests. They have a professional interest and a professional responsibility to promote the interests of the principal, of the person they're the agent of. That's something that automatically sets up a conflict of interest. There are times when, of course, those converge. When the real estate agent is most likely to get that commission, for example, when they successfully lead you to a house you're happy with and can afford and successfully purchase. And so I don't want to say that this is constant or intermittent. In some of these professions, it only happens sometimes. But it can happen, certainly, that the interest of the real estate agent diverges from that of the client. The agent gets paid more as a percentage the more the house costs, for example. There is an incentive on the agent's part to push you toward a more expensive house. And of course, if they get a higher percentage, if they direct you to a house that is actually listed by their own company, they have an incentive to push you toward a house that was listed by their own firm. There can be all sorts of settings like that. The auto salesman may be paid on commission and has an incentive to push you toward the more expensive car or to purchase the more expensive option, even if it's not in your interest. The attorney has an interest in racking up those billable hours, so the self-policing professions are ones, and the ones that bill by the hour are already special cases of this kind of principal-agent problem. But of course, this can affect any business manager. What is promoting your professional interests and personal interests by better promoting your career is something that may or may not serve the interests of the organization. I've seen this happen again and again in university administrations, where people rise and get well known and in fact become presidents of universities or chancellors of university systems. They do that by promoting initiatives that they can claim as their own. But often these initiatives do not have a very positive effect on the organization. I've seen this happen where it created a huge amount of work for chairs, for deans, for associate deans, and so on. And then nobody ever looked at it or paid any attention to it later at all. It looked great on paper. It was in fact a nightmare in practice. These programs tend to promote the interest of the administrator behind them, not the actual corporation, not the company, not the university, not the hospital system, etc., etc. It's really a step on the ladder of that person's career. It makes no sense from the point of view of the institution whose interests they're supposed to be serving. This is a hard problem to solve. In a sense, it is just part of the principal-agent relationship. And so how do we resolve the difficulty, the conflict of interest that is created by the relationship between the agent and the principal? I think it's a hard question. We have to think about those techniques for resolving conflicts of interest. We do want to require things like disclosure. We do want to have cases stated openly. We want the principal to be able to really review the possible decisions the agent is making. We want to have some institutional structures in place to try to make sure that managers are serving the interest of the larger company and the public interest rather than simply their own career interests. But it's very hard to do that. And in some kinds of organizations, it may be almost impossible. Friedrich Hayek, in his book The Road to Serfdom, has a chapter which he entitles Why the Worst Rise to the Top. And that's a discouraging chapter. He's talking there specifically about planning organizations and socialist organizations, but it's a point that applies much more broadly. If we don't have institutional checks on this, then in fact the people who promote their own interests, and their own interests most ruthlessly, tend to be the people who rise to the top. It's not just true in dictatorships. It's true in any kind of organization, unless we put into place various kinds of checks and balances to stop it from happening. So one of the questions of an institutional character that we need to think about hard in the context of an organizational ethics is what kinds of institutional structures can be created to limit this problem. I don't think anything can eliminate it. It is inherent in the principal-agent relationship. But we can have ways of mitigating it, of trying to dampen its effects, of trying to protect the interests of the public and the interests of the organization at large in the face of the constant temptation agents are placed under to promote their own interests instead.